My name is Jerm. This is Germ Warfare, the battle of ideas. Okay, there we go. Vanessa Beeley, thank you for joining me in the trenches.
You're welcome. It's a little bit early, but we'll do our best.
I think it's earlier for me than for you.
It is, but you're only asking the questions as we just discussed.
I'm gonna turn my camera off and let you speak for the duration
for the entire hour.
But I actually want to talk to you about something serious.
Yes, I know.
Look, I've seen an increase in this weird trope, this weird narrative, Vanessa, that Iran or Lebanon or just about any resistance force in your side of the world can't possibly do it on its own. They're in on it. They're basically all buddies with Israel and the US. Have you seen this kind of engineered narrative?
Yeah, of course I have. I mean, actually, to a degree, I've been pushing back against it, and I do actually just want to make the point. It would be worthwhile actually speaking to, and I know that you do, to Iranians, to Palestinians, to Lebanese, to the actual people from the region, because that is the failure of these narratives, is that they're entirely based generally upon Western media archives and documentation. It is very rare that I see any of these analysts or commentators actually reach out to people from the region to better understand the circumstances of certain aspects of their history, right? I mean, if you look at the history of Hamas, even I'm not an expert on that, because from its creation in Egypt, it splintered into so many different directions. It formed alliances in so many different complexes and areas. This whole subject is so complex that it cannot be reduced down to one narrative of Israel is funding Hamas, or Iran is part of the global satanic cabal, etc., etc. It's impossible. Iran is a country of 90 million people, right? Its government is in opposition to the Islamic Revolution to a large degree. The reformist government that was elected after the death, I think it was an assassination, of President Raisi and Foreign Minister Abdul Hayyan, right? So I actually had this conversation on a podcast last night, and I think the difficulty is that people seem to love reducing narratives down to something,
Yes.
To sound bites, to something that is very easy to digest, rather than the complex, nuanced research that people actually do put forward. And what happens is that you end up in teams, and this team that believes X is simply fighting with this team that believes Y, and then that middle ground gets completely consumed by these competing narratives. And then there's very little oxygen left for people to have a genuinely open, rational, intelligent debate over it.
So it's intellectually lazy, because what they're doing is looking for, as you say, a one-liner. It's binary. It's a false dichotomy. It's either 1 or 0. And I think this is probably a result of human nature trying to find the fastest way from A to B. But the reality is that it's a lot more nuanced and a lot more complex.
Yeah, it is. And I think social media has played a huge part in this. in kind of dumbing down debate and the introduction of bot farms and COINTELPRO to actually push narratives or defend narratives or attack narratives and so on, right? It creates this environment. I mean, I don't know about you, but I hate going on X. I literally go and post. I don't get involved because the chance of actually someone that genuinely wants to ask questions is so slim. And I do apologize to anyone that is genuinely asking questions because it makes you very kind of defensive. That environment makes you very defensive and very kind of reluctant to engage in any kind of what doesn't appear to be genuine debate, right? And another thing that I really wanted to say, because I'd been thinking about it this morning before coffee, is I find it, as someone that lived in Syria for 10 years, that was in Gaza 2012 to 2013, 2012, during one of the Zionist aggressions, Syria, for working there for 10 years, living there for 5 years, even during the last days, now in Lebanon, and seeing the ongoing genocide of the Lebanese people in the south of Lebanon, right? I find it incredibly insulting to hear these narratives. I mean, we've just, living here, the last few days have been nothing but the funeral of the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, in Iran. And the power of emotion, the cohesion of that population behind the Islamic Revolution, and even, in a sense, consuming the reformist government and forcing them to become more belligerent towards the US and Israel, that is effectively just murdered their supreme leader and the supreme leader of Shia Islam to some degree globally. Right, this is enormous, and I don't think it's as if someone assassinated the Pope. Literally, it's as if China assassinated the Pope. Right, it's for people to understand the enormity of this. And even last night, there were something like, I mean, Trump is claiming something like 80 strikes. But there were a huge number of martyrs among the Iranian forces, right?
Sorry, I don't mean to be laughing, but did you hear what Trump said? the Islamic Republic of Japan.
Yeah, well, you know what? I'm so kind of sick of Trump and his psychotic, malignant psychopathy. I mean, it's just, you know, in the midst of those funeral ceremonies, and he's describing this country as a cancer, as scum. It's one of the most ancient civilizations in our world today, with an academic, artistic, scientific history that puts us to shame in the West, right? And he's coming out with these kind of statements. I find it's so disgusting. It's abhorrent. And
yeah,
so
it's disrespectful.
therefore, how I perceive it is these, and I'm sorry to say it, unresearched, reductionist, lazy narratives, because people love to believe in a conspiracy theory. And it's always perceived through a Western lens.
That is very important, what you're saying there, Vanessa.
Yeah.
Sorry, I interrupted you, but that right there, looking through these things through a Western lens.
Yeah. Utterly. There's no attempt to understand the ideology and the culture of the Islamic Revolution in Iran, or even regionally, the culture and the civilization, the history, the heritage. Nothing. You know, or the centuries of oppression and interference by Western agencies and the global capitalist cabal. And when we line that up, I just look at it as serving the Zionist movement and serving imperialism, serving neocolonialism. It's not doing anything else. Because what happens when people read a narrative that, for example, Hamas has been funded by Israel, which is actually not true. Again, that's a reductionist view. It's based on a lot of opposition material within Israel against Netanyahu, by the way. Opposition forces within Israel that were trying to discredit Netanyahu. So they're happy to base their findings and their conclusions on effectively Zionist narratives. And then, well, Western media narratives are equivalent to Zionist narratives as far as I'm concerned anyway, without trying to actually understand the history. There is, as I've said before, since their creation, Hamas has undergone multiple remodelings, rebrandings, splinter groups, splinter factions. And I will be the first person to say that Hamas had a very detrimental role in Syria from 2011 until 2017 under the leadership of Khalid Mashal. In 2017, Khalid Mashal was sidelined by the resistance axis, by basically through negotiations by Iran and the Lebanese resistance. And then Yahya Sinwar came to the fore and various other members of the military wing and the former political wing that had never abandoned their allegiance or their alliance to the resistance axis. And all of this context is never included in these conclusions. That's my problem with it. I don't rule out the fact, and I've actually gone into it to some depth to make sure that they're not correct. But I don't see them doing that level of research and documentation in order to substantiate a claim that effectively denies agency to the Palestinian resistance. And it distracts people from the cause. People actually back off when they think, oh, well, if Hamas is in it altogether, then, what's the point? That's how people's minds often work on this basis.
As I said earlier, I mean, to me, it's very intellectually lazy. If, for example, Iran's leadership were, on the same side as Israel, right? That would have meant that, I mean, it's ridiculous to think about, but that would have meant that they would have had to, Iran's leadership would have had to have willingly sacrificed thousands of its military assets, right, as part of the theater, Vanessa. They would have had to have watched its economy tank because of sanctions. Oh, yeah, we're all in it. Please sanction us. They would have had to have allowed their top scientists to be hunted down. Because we know that what was that operation called? Lion something that Israel launched on Iran to go after its nuclear facilities or nuclear research or whatever. And all of this would have to be a performance. That's the insanity of that particular narrative. It absolutely undermines complexity.
Well, it not only undermines complexity. Again, we come back to looking at everything through a Western lens, and not only through a Western lens, but through Western superiority. So in other words, part of this argument is that the Ayatollah Khomeini was brought to power by the CIA, and therefore the entire Islamic Revolution was just a CIA op because the Shah was getting too close to the Soviet Union, and so therefore they wanted to get rid of him. But they don't look at the fact that the Shah was developing one of the strongest relationships really in the region with Israel. They were developing a nuclear program with Israel. Again, this isn't even talked about, a missile program with Israel. Yes, there was the Soviet Union threat. But what I'm saying is all of this is looked at through the lens of Western superiority and the incapability of someone like Ayatollah Khomeini to actually deceive President Carter and the CIA. And that has actually been admitted, by the way, in a number of documents and articles. Yes, of course he was in touch with President Carter and the CIA. He needed to some degree, their green light for him to return to Tehran. But I'll read you something from a BBC Persia article. And BBC Persia is effectively Mossad, right? So at the end of this, they go through the whole history. And basically, they talk about how Khomeini played President Carter. He lulled him into a false sense of security that he would return and the US would maintain their interests in Iran. That he would maintain the military that was considered to be loyal to the Shah. That proved to not be correct either. So he pushed Carter and the CIA into a corner to an extent where they had to facilitate his return to Tehran because the greater bogeyman at that time was the Soviet Union, right? And they didn't want Iran to fall into the hands of the Soviet Union. So to some degree, Ayatollah Khomeini was seen as a better option. But at the end of the article, and I do recommend that people read it because it puts a different slant. It's the same information, but it puts a completely different slant on it, which people never talk about. So they actually say, unlike Carter, Khomeini pursued a consistent strategy and played his hand masterfully. Guided by a clear vision of establishing an Islamic republic, the Ayatollah engaged America with empty promises, understood its intentions, and marked towards victory. And less than a year later, Khomeini, while holding the US chargé d'affaires and dozens of other Americans during the Iranian hostage crisis, declared, America can't do a damn thing. Is that someone that's been put in by the CIA and President Carter? You know, and there are multiple other narratives that I've broken down in a number of podcasts and just talks on the subject. And what I'm trying to say is I'm not entirely ruling out the potential of there being contact between American intelligence and Ayatollah Khomeini. But it's this idea that there's no way on earth that Ayatollah Khomeini could have known what he was doing. Which is that's just white supremacism, in my opinion. It's not even, because it's complete negligence towards, well, hold on a minute, this 6,000-year-old civilization, maybe they do actually understand the Americans and can work a deal which suits them long term, which it did. You know?
It's the same thing that we get here on the African continent, Vanessa. We Africans are too stupid to do anything ourselves, so we always require the West, to help us, or the East, or whatever. And we don't really have a very good track record. That is true. But so what? We also have been heavily colonized over the centuries, and it takes time to
same as this region,
yeah, it takes time to what's the word, to counterbalance. But I mean, going back to what you're talking about, even the terminology used is quite Western, is quite Eurocentric. The term Middle East is it's based on Europe. It's the location of that region based on Europe. It's Eurocentric. So the framework itself is psychological.
Yeah, it is, and it's also it's also a kind of trying to think. It's a prejudice against what the Islamic Revolution represents, or even what Palestinian resistance represents, which is the Islamic part of it. If Iran was actually demonstrating, I don't know, a collectivist society without religion at its base, I reckon they would have more supporters. The fact that Iranian society is presenting a model of governance which everyone in the West should be envious of, where you have free healthcare, you have free education, you have to qualify for it, but it's free, where you have the level of societal cohesion that we've been seeing certainly since the 40-day war, but even after the 12-day war, right? It's something, and the power of the people. Because you do have a reformist kind of neoliberal government and negotiating team, but you can see the pressure that is being put on them by the people going out on the streets for more than 100 days and now going out in their millions for the funeral of Ayatollah Khamenei. Not only in Iran, but also in Iraq, right? A community which has been targeted since the 1990s through sanctions, through war, through bombing, colonialization. I mean, it's effectively occupied by the United States, and yet you're still seeing millions going out on the street in support, right? So I think and that's kind of sad, because if you were to remove the Islamic aspect from it, more people would be in sympathy. And that is because that Islamophobic narrative has been engineered and orchestrated, and I know you've had Dr. David Miller on to talk about this, by the Zionists themselves. They know what they're doing. They're brainwashing you into thinking that Islam is bad and is the enemy of Christianity and so on, and the enemy of the West. But what is the enemy of the West? Israel, the Zionist movement, and the perversions of Islam that have been created by the West and by Israel and the Zionist Arab states on the Persian Gulf, right? Then by that, I mean Al-Qaeda, ISIS, all of those kind of anomalies within Islam.
Yes. I was just thinking now how to word this, but it is true that when you speak to Muslims, they will look down on the West. But when I was in China, they also did. So it has nothing to do with what they believe. It's not about the religion. It's just simply about geopolitics.
I would argue that Muslims, genuine Muslims, don't look down on the West. In fact, I would say it's almost the opposite. They still look up to the West. Sadly, in my opinion, in many cases.
Yes,
and
but I'm saying that. Sorry,
how that works.
I'm saying that more of a joke, though.
Sorry,
no. I'm just saying it's more of a joke. It's not really a serious thing, because everybody knows that we all need one another.
Yeah, I mean, look, there is a lot of, I won't say ignorance, but there's a lot of misunderstanding about what Muslim countries are, and I'm not including, we've had this discussion before, I'm not including the Zionist Arab states like UAE, Kuwait, even Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and so on. But if, for example, you were in Syria pre the fall of Damascus, it's a secular country. So while it's Muslim majority, every single sect and minority was given free reign. So Christmas was actually celebrated more, to some degree, more by the Muslims, because Muslims were in majority, but they celebrated Christmas, than by the Christians inside Syria. Very much the same, even though Lebanon is a sectarian society, because the Maronite Christians have historically aligned themselves with Israel rather foolishly, and prior to that with the French Crusaders, which is where they try to portray their roots as coming from, which is a form of kind of snobbery and again, supremacism. But even so, when you go into the southern Muslim communities, you won't find a warmer, more hospitable society than there, right? And when we talk about, I mean, we've been sold the narrative of Iran's oppression of women and so on, which, by the way, was also used to lead operations against Afghanistan. And I would argue that women now have far less rights than they did prior to US, UK neo-colonialist interference in Afghanistan. But if you look at Iran, and if you listen to some of the women, and it's mostly women that are speaking out, by the way, in the interviews coming out from the streets, both during the war and now during the funeral, don't tell me that these ladies are oppressed. I've been to places in Iran, including Tehran, Shiraz, Esfahan. The women are some of the strongest I've ever met. The same here in Lebanon, the same in Syria, although, as I said, Syria was much more of a secular society. But that strength also comes from defending themselves against neocolonialism for decades and being perceived as being, or being even dehumanized, right, through the process of propaganda narratives and so on. Because when the narratives are running oppression of women narratives, what do you think that actually does to the women that don't feel oppressed inside Iran? It's insane. It's actually has a kind of reverse effect, and that's the whole point.
Well, I mean, looking at America's OnlyFans culture, I do wonder whether it's a good idea for those women to have rights.
Well, yeah, and I mean that's another aspect of it, isn't it? In Iran, there's no assisted dying bill. There's no transgender movements. Transgenderism does exist. I actually asked about it when I was there in 2022. And they said, yeah, it exists, but there's a very lengthy process for people to go through in order to be, given permission
And it's
to
not
have
celebrated.
the operation.
They don't fly flags and all that stuff.
No, it's not. But that's what I'm saying. There's no movement to support it, which is what is happening in the West. I don't have anything against genuine transgenders. I do have something against the entire movement and weaponization of it, which is actually destroying women's rights, right? When you have a man that thinks he's a woman who can enter whatever they are, I don't even know, cross-gender toilets and harass women, or in the sporting environment, because people always question me over this. But women are at threat from this. So therefore, women's rights are being degraded, in my opinion, by the movements, not by the actual. I have sympathy for genuine transgender
Yes, of course.
people.
Yes.
But I don't have any sympathy for how it is being weaponized to achieve the aims of the establishment and the predator class. No, I don't. And that's the point. Everything gets weaponized in the West. Assisted dying is effectively part of the eugenics agenda. It's part of transhumanism and so on. But you don't find that in these countries. It doesn't exist. If we're talking about global capitalism, Iran, and even Catherine Austin Fitts has said this, Iran is outside the global capitalist mafia, right? Because from 1983, they introduced usury-free banking. The same here in Lebanon, by the way. The Hezbollah banks, the Qassad banks, are usury-free. So people can take their gold, have the gold valued, receive the loan. The gold remains there. It's a bit like, I guess it's a bit like an old-fashioned pawn shop. And then they don't pay any interest on that loan. And when they've paid it back, they go and get their gold back. I'm making it very simple, but just for people to understand how it actually works. Right. And I mean, we can come on to the COVID issue as well, because I find this quite interesting, is how people have also weaponized that against Iran. It was the same thing in Syria. Look, when COVID kind of hit the headlines, let's say, of course, initially Syria took some action, but it rapidly disintegrated, like rapidly, to the point where the president was like, "This is ridiculous. It's having more negative effect on an already hemorrhaging economy. We'll stop the lockdown," and so on. It really wasn't taken very seriously anyway. There were far more important things to worry about, like war. And in Iran, again, people have not done their research. Ayatollah Khamenei was actually described by a number of media outlets as a super spreader because he believed genuinely that COVID was a US bioweapon. He banned the use of US vaccines. And then there was an entire COVID fact sheet on Iran written by Mike Pompeo. And I really recommend people go and read that, because it effectively reads like a regime change operation. Iran is not following protocol. Iran is not taking COVID seriously. Iran is killing its people by not taking COVID seriously, and therefore there's a good reason for intervention. I'm paraphrasing because it's a 16, from memory, it's a 16-point fact sheet, basically demonizing Iran for its lack of response to COVID.
But you mentioned earlier the 12-day war. That's what I was trying to get to. It was Israel's Operation Rising Lion, and it was, I think, in 2025, where they directly...
Roaring Lion? I get lost with all of these.
Yeah, I mean, they
ridiculous operations.
They launched an attack directly on Iran. And then, of course, you had the 12-day war as a consequence. Now, if you are in cahoots, this is a very, very costly and expensive way of showing that.
Yeah, again, I don't really know what to say. Like last night, again, there were martyrs from the US bombing. And yet we're supposed to believe that Iranians are just going to sacrifice their own people or the Iranian leadership, and particularly the Islamic Revolution leadership, the IRGC and the supreme leadership. Yes, of course. Look, it's and this is another thing. When people kind of talk about Iran, they talk about Iran as if Iran is some monolith, and it isn't. A vast country comprising multiple sects and minorities and refugees, population of 90 million. It is not going to be homogenous. Of course it isn't. And of course there are elements within Iran, as there are within any supposedly free country. There were within Syria. Of course there are in Yemen, right, that are being impacted by Western coercion and incentivization, that are neoliberal in their thinking. But what I will say, when I was there in 2022, so immediately after the Mahsa Amini riots, which again was part of the Mossad operation, and Mossad has admitted that they formed a special operations group back at the end of 2021. So they were also running the Mahsa Amini riots, and they were running the Bazari riots in January of this year. We now know that as a fact. So for the last 4 years, they've been running interference in Iran. And now, by the way, they're running interference in Slovenia, in Hungary, in Greece, in Cyprus, in European countries. So this is not anything that we should be particularly shocked at. Does that mean that Slovenia and Cyprus and Greece and so on are all in on it? Yes, they are now, because the Israeli influence has actually imposed governments that are pro-Israel, pro-Zionist, and pro-global capitalism, right? But in Iran, you still have a situation where the Islamic Revolution is still true to its core ideology, its core principles and ethics of protecting the oppressed in the region and globally. Whereas within the government, you have, like President Pezeshkian, you have a neoliberal. And that's very clear. He doesn't, in many of his statements, that most people are just cringing because he's not representing the will of the people, effectively. The will of the people are the statements that are coming from the people on the streets that we've been watching for the last week or so, and during the 40-day war and the 12-day war. I don't know if I answered the question. I might have gone off on a tangent.
No. I was just trying to find information on Stuxnet. Do you remember that? That was around 2009, 2010, when Israel...
vaguely, yeah.
So Israel deployed something called Stuxnet, which was a piece of malware, software, like a virus, effectively, specifically engineered to physically destroy uranium enrichment programs in Iran. All right, and it worked. Now, this was a cyber attack, and it's one of the world's first cyber attacks that we know of that actually had real-world consequences. And, if you're in on it together, This is not going well for you.
No, but someone said to me the other day, and they're American, they basically said to me, look, I don't believe that any government is going to follow a policy which is to the detriment of the government and the country. But let's have a look at what Iran has done since 1979. It had basically the Iran-Iraq war, because I think that was as a result of like the American administration figuring out, oh, no, actually, we didn't have Ayatollah Khomeini under control, and now we have lost control of Iran, right? And so then they foisted the Iraq war on them. And this is after also having kind of completely destabilized Iraq in 1991. So this is, then later destabilizing Iraq in 1991, which was leading towards the war against Syria, etc. So this is all part of the same operation to some degree, but Iran withstood disproportionate force from Iraq, backed also by the Soviet Union, by the way. I'm not leaving them out of the equation here. I think the Soviet Union actually provided more weapons and hardware than the United States in this, because the Soviet Union has also always coveted, particularly northern Iran and the Caspian Sea, as a warm water port, right? That historically has been the case, and I don't think it's actually very different now, because Russia is very much aligned with Israel anyway. But historically, Russia has had a role in the destabilization and annexation of areas in Iran, particularly alongside the British in the 1900s. So I think, are you really? I mean, look at all the countries that are a part of the global capitalist cabal. Are they under sanctions?
Well, no, I mean, that's the point.
Are they facing military interference? Yeah, I know, but this is the point. It doesn't make any sense to me.
I mean, I think inflation in Iran...
Look at Syria. Now that they've imposed Al-Qaeda, well, how about women's rights? They're now being forced not only to veil, but actually wear the burqa, 1. 2, now, of course, you have all of the kind of financial vultures coming in, predators coming in, including Macron in the last 2 days, to introduce digital banking systems, to bring in development loans, IMF loans, and so on, to enforce debt and slavery. That hasn't happened in Iran. I mean, in the sense that, is Iran flourishing? It's unbelievable what it has achieved, despite the sanctions, despite the isolation, despite the constant threat of war, and despite the fact that it's been supporting resistance actors and states in the region since 1979. It broke the blockade with Yemen in the last 3 days, which is extraordinary. No one in the West is being told about this, by the way. But they've flown planes into Sana'a, and Yemen launched missiles to bring down the Saudi anti-aircraft missiles, right? So Iran has broken the blockade on Yemen. It's empowered Yemen to the point where Yemen is now saying, listen, we will have a unified Yemen. We don't want Saudi Arabian influence anymore inside Yemen. We will close the Bab el-Mandeb Strait. We will invade Saudi Arabia if Syria is weaponized against Lebanon, right? So what are you seeing? You're seeing a cohesion in the region against US interests, against Israeli interests, against neocolonialist interests. That wouldn't come from an entity that is in on it.
You mentioned the sanctions, and that's a big deal. I mean, I think inflation in Iran hit around 40% a year ago. That's quite high.
Yeah.
And that's not something that you willingly do to your own country.
Yeah, you say that, but I mean, it was quite interesting when I went in 2022, and it's not a criticism of the Iranian people, because they're living through whatever hardships they were living through economically. But I came in from Syria where we had, 2 hours of electricity every 6 hours, where there was literally no fuel. People were bringing it in, the mineral water 5 liter gallon containers from Lebanon and selling it on street corners, like literally. We didn't have water, hot water, because no electricity, but we didn't have water, etc., etc. Right? The economy was absolutely rock bottom. And then I go to Iran and I go to interview people in some of the poorer suburbs of Tehran, some of the poorest suburbs. One, the suburbs are unbelievably clean. This is kind of a shock to me coming from Syria, where, of course, rubbish collection also was a major issue. And so rubbish was piled up on street corners and so on. That's number one. Number two, I entered the houses of people there. Everyone, it was too hot. I mean, this was January. It was freezing cold. But the houses were boiling hot because everyone has gas. Everyone has electricity. Everyone has subsidized food. Everyone has water. So when people were interviewing me and kind of saying, oh, what do you think about the economy in Iran? I'm just like, dude, you're fine. You've got every amenity you can possibly want. Yeah, sure. If you want to covet Western consumerism and capitalism, that's different. But actually, as basic necessities, the government is providing pretty much everything. I was seriously impressed. And the cost of fuel at the pump was insane. I mean, it was cents. To fill up a car was I think, from memory, less than $1.
The inflation thing, though, is something I can relate to because I grew up in apartheid and we had very high inflation. Not as high as 40%. I think it was at its peak around 21%, and interest rates were sometimes around 25%, making it almost impossible to buy a home. And even then, that was tough. But weirdly enough, we could get by, which is kind of what you're alluding to with the Iranians. Look, eventually, I think you choke eventually with those sorts of numbers, but you can buffer against it for quite a while. I mean, Iran has clearly been doing that.
I think the difference, if you look at Syria and Iran, is the government in Syria, because, of course, their resources were deliberately occupied by the United States and by proxies of the United States. So that was a huge issue. But we do, and we shouldn't underestimate the US combined campaign against Iran. If they do bomb water desalination facilities, if they do start bombing essential infrastructure, then there is less capability from the state to be able to provide for their people. That's for sure. But then again, it's like, well, why would that be happening if Iran is in on it? that just doesn't make any sense to me. Yes, and I'm going to keep circling back to this. Are there elements within Iran that would potentially be collaborating with the West to regime change? Yeah, of course. Were there elements inside Syria? Yes, of course. Were there elements inside Syria that were incentivized even in later years by the West and even by allies of Syria in order to basically weaken the government and overthrow it in the end? Yes, of course.
Yeah, I mean, Vanessa, this is the sort of David Ickean way of looking at everything. I like David, but the whole vector pointing towards, a group of people and then one person and then a simulation right at the top. It's great for selling books, but I don't think it is a reflection of reality. What is obvious to me is that, yes, there are obviously oligarchs, elites who are in cahoots. There obviously are all sorts of games of chess being played. We know this. This is not even, conspiratorial. But at the same time, there are competing individuals, competing groups, competing organizations, competing governments, competing factions. This is the nature of how we live. You take your suburb that you live in and just look at the conflict that happens between just normal people. Now that happens all the way to the top. So the idea that suddenly they're all good buddies having cocktails together is utterly absurd. It's Monty Python-esque in its stupidity.
Before I sort of by accident got into activism and then journalism, I used to be in the corporate world. And if you probably have some experience of that as well. But if you're working for a big conglomerate, it's insane. But it's just on a micro level, and the risks are much higher at the macro level, at the world global dominance level, right? And the sacrifices are much greater, or not the sacrifices, but the sacrifice of obstacles is much greater. And I think it's just, this is what I always say, is that as human beings, we simply haven't really evolved, because all that's happening now, we just have kind of the recycling of empires. So we go through one imperialist era and then we enter another one, and then, whether it's next going to be China or it's going to be a combination of China and the US. I don't really include Russia in there because they're struggling now. And if you look at their GDP, it's not great in comparison, not by any stretch of the imagination, against China and the US, right? In my opinion, nothing really changes. We just enter another paradigm of empire. It's like, do you know what I mean? And it's in a sense, I look at that and I just think, well, okay, but shouldn't we all be looking at how we stop that cycle? And again, I was having this conversation last night with people who are inherently anti-government, leaning towards anarchy. I don't think humanity is ready for anarchy. I don't.
No, but it's not. It's. I mean, it's more of an ideology. Yeah, it's an ideological thought experiment. It's not realistic.
Yeah. Well, not based on the world that we have at the moment. But I think that the best you can have, and this is how I kind of see the Iran model, is that you have a system of guidance. You have a system of ethics and principles that people discover that if they follow, their life has a rhythm, their life has a meaning, their life has a structure to it. Right. What do we see in the West? We see that structure broken down. We've seen the spiritual structure broken down. We've seen the familial structure broken down. We've seen the community structure broken down to a point where it's very easy to centrally govern and control. And that's when you enter a kind of totalitarian state paradigm, which we're heading towards, particularly in the UK, but in EU countries, in the United States, and so on. Right, because that entire structure has been disintegrated deliberately. But that structure is still intact in Iran. And it was still intact in Syria. It's still intact in the south, in Lebanon. It's still intact in Yemen. Now, if you don't want to put the label of Islam on that, that's also fine, because it's a collectivist structure, which to some degree, I would be perfectly happy to live in, where there are these guiding principles. Look, how many Western countries could you see the millions, the tens of millions of people on the streets in 40 degrees heat in Iran and Iraq the last few days and not see some violence, not see some looting, not see some corruption, or you know what I mean? There's nothing. You just see people helping each other out, giving each other food, water, helping each other through the crowds and so on. You don't see any of the eruption that you would see in the West, in my opinion. I can't even imagine right now any head of state that would kind of generate that number of people on the streets, to be honest. But that's beside the point.
And what's also funny about the "they're in on it" narrative is that you'll notice very conveniently that it's the Western countries that aren't the ones, losing their own economies and important people at the top. It's again framed within that Eurocentric paradigm.
Well, yeah. And I'll give you an example. Like, if you've been following the narrative about the Mossad operation, Black Cube, and there's also Black Core, that have effectively been running interference operations against governments in Slovenia and Hungary, Cyprus, Greece, Romania, right? And across Europe. And Slovenia has actually put in a complaint, an official complaint, and a request for action and investigation by the EU Commission. And it's just gone into, room 101 because it's Israel. Now, if that were to be, I don't know, Iran, Russia, China, how many sanctions by now would be imposed on those countries? How fast would the war be started against them for daring to interfere in European elections? It's the hypocrisy is kind of, it's off the scale. And yet nobody is, and this is another thing with this idea that Iran's in on it and so on and so forth. Iran is the number one obstacle to Zionist expansionism. And Zionist expansionism is something, and I'm not talking about Israel, I'm talking about the entire Zionist movement and complex, which
Empire.
includes the US and the UK. Yeah, Pax Judaica. And by lumping it all in together, what are you doing? You're just entering a nihilistic universe, which I'm not interested in, to be honest. I lived through Syria, which was one of the most kind of traumatic events of my life. I mean, up until the last hour, I thought something was going to happen. The Syrian army would something would happen, because for the 14 years in Syria, I never had the belief other than Syria was going to succeed, because the resistance had been so powerful there. It had, the help particularly of Iran, which was being regularly targeted by Israel inside Syria. And that's another thing. Why would Iran go to the help of Syria, or to the help of Yemen, or to the help of Lebanon? Why would Iran include Lebanon as the number one point on its MOU agenda? The end of aggression against every country in the region. Right? Why would it do that? Because surely, if it's in on it, it would just come to the table and say, okay, we'll agree to this and you give us that. And it would be a typical corporate deal. But they're putting the principle of the defense of the free peoples in this region as the number one point on the agreement, which is only going to bring greater aggression against them, greater punishment, greater collective punishment. Why would they do that?
It's propaganda, and I wonder where it's coming from. Would you say Israel? Would you say the West?
Look, these kind of Mossad units, the Unit 8200 units like Black Cube, and there are multiple. It's an entire complex, right? We know, for example, Honduras gate tapes. We know that Israel was involved in the release of Hernandez, the former genuine narco state warlord, and the bringing in of right-wing governments in Latin America, the kidnap of Maduro. And so the running of narratives, I saw a conference the other day on AI with a bunch of Israelis. And there was one individual, I can't remember her name now, But she was basically saying, look, it's great, actually, that we're heading towards AI producing information because we know we can advocate to all of these companies and ensure that the information they're putting out is pro-Israeli. So as you know, as we're getting pushed down this kind of streamlining of information route towards AI, then they have greater and greater control of the narratives. Beyond social media, beyond the media, which is already largely controlled by them. And so these narratives, as I said, the problem is that the analysts that are putting out this conclusion are basing it literally on Zionist and Western reports, documents, narratives, media, and so on, right? And this is my point. It's not that I'm saying there isn't a possibility of that narrative being correct, but I'm saying you've got to widen your net. You have got to include the country that you're actually saying, or the resistance actor that you're actually saying is compromised.
Yeah, I think that's pretty important. You need to apply nuance. It's the thing that I say so often. It's not binary. It's not a zero-sum game. You do have all of these maneuvers, these strategic games going on. But at the end of the day, Vanessa, it's demonstrably true that you've got competing interests happening here. I mean, controlled opposition is a real thing, but not really at that level, not between countries.
But they've tried the controlled opposition game, Jerm. How many times? You know, the Masa Amini riots, the riots in January of this year. They've tried everything. Go and read. I mean, I'm sure people have read it, but Which Path to Persia, and you'll understand exactly the strategy that they've used.
Yeah.
But it's failed. And you've only got to look at the last few days, as I said, of the funeral processions to understand to what degree it's failed, where you actually have interviews with people who are saying, you know what, I went on the streets as part of the opposition and I'm so sorry. I shouldn't have done it. I regret it.
Who wrote that document? I forget now. It was in 2009. Which Path to Persia?
It was the Brookings
Institution. Yeah, and they're one of the biggest. I think they're one of the most influential think tanks to Washington. And in fact, I think chapter 4 or chapter 5 is titled "Leave It to Bibi."
Yeah, exactly. And it's all about, and what it's actually saying is if we don't succeed in any of that, we'll just end up containing Iran. Which, of course, what does that mean? Greater isolation, greater economic punishment, and so on. And destroying all of the resistance axis, which is known as the Ring of Fire, because, basically it encircles US positions from Yemen to Iraq, formerly to Syria, although there are still resistance actors within Syria itself, to Lebanon, to Palestine, and even elements within Saudi Arabia, for example.
Okay, so time is against us, Vanessa. What's the moral of the story? Iran and Israel are big buddies and they're in on it.
No, the moral of the story is, I guess, stop looking at things through a Western lens. Start trying to look at it through the lens of other civilizations, other cultures. And it's not difficult to do. There's literature out there. There are podcasts now that are platforming people from those regions. Those questions can be asked. I'm quite happy, and I'm sure you're quite happy to do kind of an open mic session with someone from the region, and people can actually come on board and ask those questions and get the answers. I mean, I've done it with Ehsan Safanejad from Iran, who answered a lot of the questions that have been raised by people doing this kind of analysis. And I think, don't buy into a conspiracy theory every single time. There are genuine resistance actors out there who have suffered and sacrificed tremendously dealing with the machinations of Western governments and imperialist governments for decades now.
All right, Vanessa, how can I follow you?
Go to my Substack. That's the easiest one. and the least censored
What
for
is
the
it?
moment.
Vanessa Beeley.
It's just Vanessa Beeley. I'm always just Vanessa Beeley wherever I am, so I should be quite easy. But don't look at my Wikipedia because that's just a joke. But that'll be the first in the search.
Okay. Vanessa Beeley, thank you for joining the trenches.